Welcome to Arts and Entertainment,
with Chris and Randall.
the holiday edition, Christmas Carol Part 2. Hey, everybody, happy holidays. It is hopefully a Christmas Eve, and you're someplace safe and warm, or if you celebrate Christmas, you're celebrating Christmas. If you are celebrating any of the other holidays that have just fallen, if you don't celebrate holidays, that's groovy too. This is our follow-up to our episode from last week where we talked about the book, Charles Dickens, A Christmas Carol. And now we're going to deal with all the various adaptations of A Christmas Carol. So if it's December 24th, Randall, do you know what that means?
It means it's Christmas Eve.
That's right. And December 25th is Christmas Day. What's December 26th in England?
It's Boxing Day.
Right. Now, what is December 27th?
I don't know. What is it?
It's my 55th birthday. And you know what I want for my birthday?
What?
I want everybody who is watching or listening to give me one of the following gifts or all of the gifts. I'd like you to like the show. I'd like you to share the show. I'd like you to subscribe to the show. You can even comment to the show. Or if you want to even just like wish me a happy birthday, you can send an email. And where can they send an email to?
Well, go to our website, chrisandrandall.com, and you can see various ways to contact us. Go to Facebook. Send us a message through Facebook. And
I'm going to thank you in advance for your lovely gift. This was the best Christmas ever, said the nice Jewish boy named after a Roman Catholic saint. So, Randall, it's really interesting to think about this, but be honest with me. The very, very, very first time you ever encountered A Christmas Carol, did you read the book? Was the book read to you? I know your mom's a librarian. My mom's a school teacher. So it's not implausible that could have been the case. Or did you watch it?
I have no idea. I probably watched an adaptation of it on a TV series, which every TV series seems to do an adaptation.
It's pretty fair to say that the first time you ever saw A Christmas Carol, it wasn't really the Dickens A Christmas Carol. It was either a TV show that did a version of that story, or it was an actual adaptation by film or TV or animation of A Christmas Carol, right?
Right, probably, yeah. I mean,
Go ahead.
It seems like almost every TV series at some point does an adaptation of The Christmas Carol using the characters from the TV show.
That's true, and it also seems that just about every year there is a film version of it. Certainly middle schools and high schools put on production. I used to work at a theater that just put on a professional stage production every year. I mean, this is one of the things that if we were not living through a pandemic year right now, all of us would be able to go to the theater to see a live production of this story.
There are theaters that are doing productions and putting them online.
Excellent. So that's if you find any, maybe put a link below, and if not, I guess people can Google.
Yeah, they'll find it. I did a search, for the show of Christmas Carol on IMDb, and I got 367 title hits. And I did a search for Scrooge because a lot of times they just call it Scrooge, and I got 108 more times for a total of 475 hits. So there's at least 475 verified adaptations of A Christmas Carol.
Oh my God, really?
On IMDb, yeah, and that's just things that don't have an obscure title, that have Scrooge or Christmas Carol in the title. I mean, there's probably like 500 plus adaptations. I don't know. I would estimate maybe there's like, if you include all the plays that people have done, there's probably like over 1,000 adaptations have been done of A Christmas Carol. I mean, this is an incredibly popular work, isn't it? I mean, I think that it could be the most popular work in the English-speaking world.
Well, yeah, because not only has the book not gone out of publication, the story, it's just I think you told me that there's a 5-minute long animated
Yeah,
one?
so if you go to YouTube, I did a search on YouTube for the most popular versions of A Christmas Carol, and there's this 5 minute long version. I think it comes out of some kind of Indian YouTube animation site. It's for kids, and it's great. And it's narrated by somebody with a thick like Indian accent, but it's great. And the narrator pronounces Ebenezer as Ebenzer. I mean,
Well, it's a Hebrew word. I mean, how many cultures away? You go Hebrew to English to somebody with an East Indian pronunciation. Yeah, of course.
hilariously
Yeah,
though, it is great, and it's yeah. So YouTube even has more adaptations. I mean, there's
and
adaptations
you told me
everywhere.
it has like millions of views. This little
I think it
5 minute
has 2 million
animation.
views last I looked.
Oh my God! So would you say that A Christmas Carol is almost adaptation proof? Like there's
You know,
just no
it's
way
funny
you can
because
adapt it without making it a Christmas Carol.
well, it's funny because I watched a lot of adaptations getting ready for this show, and uh, it seems like the best adaptations deviate very little. And the more an adaptation deviates, the worse it gets. And even when an adaptation goes down to 5 minutes, as long as they keep in like the most important elements, it seems to work.
You know,
Dickens' work is just it's modular. It stands up. I mean, I don't know why it's so robust, but it just
well,
works.
it's interesting because I think you're right in that none are totally complete, and some add details and some subtract details, and where they choose to lay the emphasis and where they don't. It really says as much about the culture and the time of the adaptation as the original source material. And yet, it all really starts with Charles Dickens himself. So he writes this when he's 31. It's not self-published, but the way that his publishing deal works is he only makes money on the circulation. He got caught up in the very first year of publication with an expensive lawsuit. So the first couple of years that the book came out, he's making some money, but it's not covering expenses. And after about 6 years, in 1849, Dickens, who, as you pointed out, trained as an actor, uh, goes around England, especially around of course, the Christmas holidays, and he gives readings of the Christmas Carol. And he's tremendous at what he does. Again, trained as an actor. He also, it's his own work. He wrote it. And that's actually when A Christmas Carol becomes popular. A Christmas Carol becomes popular once everyone starts going to these staged readings where he plays all of the characters. And it's interesting because if you really look at the way that this particular story, it's really good oral storytelling, isn't it? When you look, if you just randomly right now pick up a copy of the book, go on Gutenberg Project if you don't have the book, and just read like any paragraph, right? It almost just reads like a script.
Well, that shows Dickens' stage experience. I mean,
Yeah.
Dickens is totally visual as a storyteller. I mean,
Right.
he's
There's
a master of it.
sound, there's noise, there's tonality, but even the narrator's voice, right? Even the narrator's description, the third person omniscient, is in the active tense. You know, there's wit, there's humor, there. To even read the narration is a lot of fun. When in the previous episode, we did read a couple of lines from it, just because it's a joy. It's oral. It's almost like the Bible, another great oral tradition. In the common vernacular. And while there's a lot of work of Dickens that has great oral style, this is far more, it is the simplest of the bunch. I did listen to, and you also listened to Patrick Stewart's audio from his one-man show of his reading of the book.
Right.
And I don't know about you, but I was really, it really brought home to me what it must have been like in Dickens's day to attend one of those readings. What did you think of Patrick Stewart's?
Yeah, Patrick Stewart's reading is great. Patrick Stewart did a one-man show where
Yeah, he would do it on Broadway.
he acted out the whole play, but the only recording I think that exists of Patrick Stewart associated with this project is just him reading an abridged version of the book, which is it's spectacular anyway. Yeah, just go ahead
And
and
that's
listen to.
still in almost 2 hours long.
Yeah, it's very
Which means
long.
I don't know if Dickens himself did not read an abridged version, or if there's that much left.
Well, I'll tell you
Really
something
makes
interesting
you.
about another interesting thing about A Christmas Carol is usually when people adapt it, is they choose things to omit rather
We
than
will
not.
get to that in just a sec, but I just want to finish my thought on Dickens, which is it it becomes so popular, okay, that he makes so much money, it raises the circulation of the book that from 1849 to the year of his death in 1870, every single year, this is something he does. He makes good money, it increases the sale. And as he goes from being a young man to a middle aged man, really, he physically, if you think about it, becomes the face of Ebenezer Scrooge. He is that middle aged man. He is Scrooge. And I would imagine the way people even saw Scrooge at that period of time is through the visage of of the author himself, Charles Dickens. Now, it's fair to say that even in the time that that book came out, people were writing fake sequels to it. Louisa May Alcott wrote a fake sequel, and there were plays and operas written about it. You sent me a link, and it's available on YouTube to a 1910 silent film.
Yeah, there's like
Uh,
3 or 4 silent film versions of A Christmas Carol that you could look at on YouTube.
but I think you are onto something now. I just wanted to get to that point, which is what is omitted and what is kept varies from adaptation to adaptation. And another thing that I think also is worth exploring that you mentioned and we debated in the last episode is is Scrooge an everyman or is he a businessman? And I do really think that each of the ones that we're going to discuss today, on some level or another, fall into those two camps. Are we supposed to identify with Scrooge, or is Scrooge more what I would call a personification? Does he exist as an archetypal hero, one who is the over embodiment of something, or is he just reflective of who we all could become if we do not listen to the angels of our better selves?
Yeah, I
Uh,
think I think the truth is the latter. I think that's what Dickens originally intended, and
well,
what it's like in the book. But yeah, but every adaptation they make a choice to do one or the other. It seems like.
okay. Well, I would say that let's just talk about them. Okay, so the earliest version I saw was the 1935 version of A Christmas Carol, made here in the USA, directed by Henry Edwards. And this is interesting. The screenplay is written by Seymour Hicks, and Seymour Hicks, kind of like Charles Dickens, he plays Ebenezer Scrooge, and he looks the part. He is a frail old. He's kind of heavy, actually, for an old man. Some Scrooges are skinny, and some Scrooges are average height, and some Scrooges are fat. And he's a little bit more on the heavy side of Scrooge, as if we're not super portly, but he's obviously not one who has missed a meal, even if his meal is gruel. And he plays him in a very rigid way. And aesthetically, what's really fascinating is that in this film, when you see the counting house, it's full of dirt. I mean, you can literally see just dirt and sweet. It's black and white, and they do this wonderful effect of just making it look dirty and grimy and gassy, like London would have been in that gas lamp era. Even the streets are just dirty. London is it's a very even though it was made in the mid 30s and not the 20s, it definitely still borrows from German expressionism. There's a lot of stark contrast. You see also very wealthy people dining. There's this wonderful scene in a giant kitchen where they're making clearly a big meal for wealthy people, and then they're cutting off and the fish and all the parts, and you see them throwing scraps of food to all the poor people outside, who are just covered in soot. It's an interesting choice because we never see Marley when he visits. Ever, we hear the chains, we hear the voice, and Marley says, "Only you can see me, Scrooge." And it's such a, I'm sure in theatrical productions of it, it's not uncommon to do this, but it's fascinating because only Scrooge can see him. So we're never privy to what Scrooge sees. And it becomes, in some sense, a much more psychologically
Well,
provocative
do they
story.
show the ghosts, the spirits?
We will see the ghost, but we never see Marley. We have to imagine Marley because we are told that only Scrooge can see Marley because it is very particular. And then, uh, yeah, it's very interesting that way. We do see the ghosts, but they are definitely not the clearest of ghosts. They skip the childhood in this version of Scrooge. You don't actually see any of his childhood, and uh, when it comes time to it's the scariest version when he's dead, and you see all three the maid, the undertaker, and the scullery maid all in like heavy chiaroscuro of black and white, dark and white features, selling off all of Scrooge's stuff. It's also the only one that features. You actually see Tiny Tim lying dead on a bed. You know, it's very stark. I mean, it doesn't really feel like a ghost story as much as it feels very expressionistic. But the level of you're so aware in that version of class distinction. There's a scene where the Lord Mayor of London is having this beautiful banquet and sings "God Save the Queen," and you see all these elegant people, and then you see all these other poor people in bars and taverns doing the exact same thing, and you're very aware of the class inequity in that production. Uh, as far as the performance of Scrooge goes, I'm not that keen on it. I'll be honest with you. It's okay, but he seems to vacillate, Hicks, between being very stodgy and being very scared, and then finally just a little over the top in his joy. A little bit too mad when he comes to Jesus, as they say. Now let's talk about what many people consider to be, I would say, the seminal Christmas Carol, also called Scrooge, the 1951 edition. You saw that one as well,
Yes.
with Alistair Sim as Ebenezer Scrooge.
Yeah, and I want to say that Alistair Sim, he plays Scrooge as an everyman. He's very humble. He's a very average, normal person. Um, I really like his performance. I mean, I think most people love his performance in this movie. He plays Scrooge as just a very unextraordinary person. He you can almost see him change as the movie goes on from scene to scene. You see his emotional reaction very clearly in every scene. He doesn't play
It's,
anything.
it's interesting to me because I know that later on we'll have a debate on this one. I definitely think that Sim is playing the humor more. He's a witty curmudgeon at the beginning when he delivers those lines about the people who should be poked with pudding, or I pay my taxes, or they should die and contribute to the surplus population of the world, which is actually a quote from Thomas Malthus, who's a big believer in social Darwinism. There's a glibness and wit to him that I think is missing in the Hicks production, and it does make you realize that this is a smart man. He's a clever, worldly man. How do you feel about that opening where we do see Jacob Marley?
Uh, I mean, almost every adaptation, the Marley scene is very similar. I think it's great.
I mean,
I
but
mean,
I would say that it to me, it does feel a lot more like a '50s horror film. The way they use the overriding score, the makeup,
yeah, well,
it.
it is interesting that a lot of adaptations they choose whether to play up the horror more or less.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if playing up the horror in any of these adaptations even works. I mean, when I was watching them and I see them trying to make it more of a horror movie, I don't know if it really adds anything to the adaptation. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that in its day, it might have been the best call, because imagine seeing it on a big screen in 1951. Maybe to the people who are there for a horror film, that was a great moment. And maybe if I honestly saw it on stage, kind of like Phantom of the Opera, the Grand Guignol, would speak to me. But you're right, when you're just watching it up by yourself in the middle of the day on a TV screen with 5 more Scrooges to go, you definitely kind of check out.
There is a weird detail that Charles Dickens puts in the original story where Marley's ghost, his jaw needs to be closed shut with a bandage that goes all around his head, and that's a fairly horrific detail. Probably
Which
the worst.
They keep in this version.
They keep it in this version. Well, not every version includes that detail, and most of the versions they do something different with it. Some are more horrific than others.
Now, I really like what they added to this story.
What did they add?
They add a lot in the past. Well, so in this story, they give Ebenezer a hiring scene where he is originally working for Mr. Fezziwig, and then he gets stolen away by, as you just argued in the last episode, a man who represents modern industry, the new ways, as opposed to the old, which Fezziwig holds on to. And instead of meeting Dick, he actually just meets Jacob Marley, and they find that they're men cut of a similar cloth. There's a proposal scene that's quite lovely and endearing between him and Belle. True, there is no Fanny here at all, but this scene, or is there a scene with Fanny? I actually may have missed it. Either way, I feel that by having a scene, it counterbalances well when it doesn't work out between them, because you see at least what could have been. I'm glad that we're spared the scene of her having children, to be honest with you.
Yeah, oh, you mean when the spirit takes him to her new husband, her actual husband?
Yeah. Well, they make a completely radical choice, don't they? They don't give her that fate.
What do they do for her?
They actually honor. Well, it's interesting, and they honor her convictions instead of her ever getting. See, this is always something that bothered me in the book, is that she's like, "Oh, I'm not about money. I'm about you being an okay guy." And then what does she do? She marries a guy who's just essentially a wealthy guy who's actually a bit of a dick, if we're really about it, because it's like, oh, I was walking by and I saw Ebenezer all by himself. Well, honestly, he's an asshole.
Well,
in this version,
I've seen that played off in less assholic ways.
She does not waste her time with that kind of a dick. She doesn't waste her time getting married. She doesn't waste her time having kids. She ends up, we find out in the present, I'll jump on this one, working in an almshouse, taking care of the poor, with gray hair, no great makeup, no great middle class. She's dedicated her life to public service. I think this is amazing and wonderful. And it even makes you realize how it would have really had to have been a very different Ebenezer Scrooge.
The Bill Murray Scrooge borrows that idea too.
We'll
this
talk
version
about that later. But.
Yeah, this version it adds a lot of little details that all mostly work really great, don't they? I mean, and some of the details it adds.
I like also that while we're still in the past, I like how the man who hires him turns out to be thoroughly corrupt. He's an embezzler. And then shrewd Ebenezer Scrooge, who in this case is not an everyman but a businessman, he and Jacob Marley end up buying the company to cover the disaster that this man who hired them did. It's a very underhanded and very clever manner. And then he literally buys the same warehouse that Mr. Fezziwig actually owned, takes it over, and then offers to keep a guy on, but for less money. It's very clever. It's very smart.
And it works, right? I mean, you think it really adds to the... And, I think there are lots of little touches in this one that other adaptations start using.
Yeah, they give they give Marley a deathbed scene, where Scrooge doesn't even come there because he's still working the clock. It's a very hard Scrooge. And then when he gets there, the Undertaker is waiting. I'm not as keen on having Marley come back because basically he's just repeating himself from, I have to tell you something, and then he comes back to tell you, but at least it gives a motivation. I forgot to get the name of the man who wrote the screenplay, but he was a playwright from South Africa who was born on Christmas Day, who had a fairly great career writing plays on the West End beforehand. And I feel like a good playwright, he adds a lot of missing motivational scenes.
Yes.
To it.
Like the end where Scrooge wakes up and he sees his maid.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think that's in the book at all, but that's a great touch because we saw the maid
betray him.
Right. We saw the maid steal his bed curtains earlier. So, I mean, it's great that she comes back. It's great that we have a scene. The last scene where Scrooge carries Tiny Tim on his shoulders.
Yeah.
That is a classic scene now that Zemeckis used in his in 2009.
Absolutely. We'll get to that in just a moment. I will say the one thing that's a bit odd about this one that's very 1950s, and I think actually at this point, blacklisting is going on, Red Scarce is going on. This one is completely devoid of any kind of class consciousness because unlike the 1935 version where you were painfully aware of the level of despair that the Cratchits lived in, these Cratchits look very middle class. Their home is elegant. Their clothing is well tailored. You really don't see so much about the money in Cratchit's life as much as the health and forbearance of Tiny Tim. And that's the only real struggle in his life, is that he's got a sickly boy. And otherwise, he seems like a solid blue-collar American, good family life, very religious, good father with 11 children who are industrious, right? Peter is about to get a job working for Ebenezer's a nephew, Fred. And notice how Peter's like a teenager and he looks like a young man. And, it feels like 1950s America in a way, the Cratchit house, doesn't it?
Well, this movie comes out of 1950s America.
And it really it has that weird kind of feeling. So it does neuter some of the class consciousness. Now, before I jump to the other Alistair Sim, the 1971 25-minute animated version, I just want to make sure, before we get to 1971, was there any version of A Christmas Carol that you saw before that one, between the 50s and the 70s?
Well, there was a 1971. There was a musical. It's gorgeous looking.
Oh yeah, tell me about that one.
Well, I think it's based on a play. I don't know that much about it. It's based on a play, I think, and it was a musical, and there's song numbers, and
Is that the one with Albert Finney?
I don't think so.
Okay, because there's a 70 also with Albert Finney that came out around then too.
There's
and
a lot.
Alec Guinness.
There's a lot.
Oh, whatever reason, the late 60s, early 70s saw a giant revival of Christmas Carol stories.
There's also, there's also like a 1969 animated version. There's a 1962, Mr. Magoo did one.
We'll get to the side adaptations momentarily. So the 71.
The 71, let me just talk about it. That was made by Robert Williams, who's a legendary animator. He supervised the production of it. This is made so well that it was on TV. It's only 24 minutes long, but it looks so amazing that it was released in theaters and it won an Oscar, and then a bunch of people were pissed off because it was on TV first, so they changed the rules for how to get an Oscar.
It's directed by Chuck Jones, who used to do the wonderful Wile E. Coyotes and Roadrunner cartoons for Warner Brothers. Alistair Sim returns after 20 years to reprise the role. But I think why this holds a special place in my heart is because this is the one that I first saw as a kid on TV. This was the version of A Christmas Carol that I remember. This was the version of A Christmas Carol that that probably wrote the story in my head. You're right. You were talking about the stylization of the animation, and it's fantastic, isn't it? I mean, I honestly have to say, uh, of all of the Marley scenes, this is my favorite. You know what I'm saying? The way that they use the black and the white and the color, the expression. This is even more than expression. There's something very haunting and terrifying. Don't you feel in that?
Yeah, they really
Talk a little
nailed
bit more
it.
about the animation.
Well, Robert Williams is one of the most legendary animators of all time. He did a lot of TV commercials during this era. Uh, he's just every animator would know who this guy is, and the animation is very detailed. There's a lot of camera movements. Um, there seems to be a lot of motion capture, possibly.
Is
Um,
this really interesting? Just visually speaking, it's the most gothic. Uh, it lifts a lot more. It's a lot closer to the actual book
yeah, that's what I wanted to
than a
say.
lot.
This is probably the closest to the book of any adaptation, I think.
Now, that said, because it is literally just 25 minutes long, it's also a highlight reel. So there is no rescue by his sister Fanny. Uh, there is no, again, no children from Belle. Uh, there is, strangely enough, an interesting thing that they do add, which is kind of a flash forward, in that when he is in Christmas present and he asks about the fate of Tiny Tim, uh, there's a vision of that empty space with just the cane, which I thought was quite lovely. And uh, they do that again, where with another part of the story where they flash forward for just a moment. The illustrations in this animation almost remind me of the John Leach illustrations of the original novel.
Oh, I never thought of that, but that's probably what they were going for.
And I do like that they create a money lending scene that is almost a lift from the money lending scene in the book. It's almost the only time they've ever really done it. And again, I do like how Sim, even 20 years later in animated, still hits all the humorous notes.
Isn't
And
it
I'll say
interesting?
that,
Yeah, 20 years later, they bring back Alistair Sim from the 1951 movie. I mean, they can't think of another actor to do it. I mean, he's it.
yeah. And I do like how in this one, when they show how Christmas is celebrated on a lighthouse, on a ship, it has a much more otherworldly nature. And I like how, to me, the criticism I have of Sim is the same that I have in the 35 version, which is I find his conversion moment, I just find him to be way too silly. And I at least will say that the silliness that he inhabits in that final act of the story works a lot better in animation than it does in a full length film. Uh, hey, folks, it's on YouTube and it's 25 minutes. By all means, watch it. So now we're going to get to the last one that I saw. I'm just going to straight out say it. It's my favorite version of A Christmas Carol, the 1984 telemovie directed by Clive Donner and stars George C. Scott as Ebenezer Scrooge. Now, I'm not saying this is perfect. Scott does not even try to have an English accent. He gives Ebenezer a gruff exterior. He uses the words. He definitely takes on the demeanor and deportment of a wealthy old man of business. But he never. It's not in his bailiwick to do this. But I love. He's fat. He's fat. He's big, and he's big in a way that is again almost like an illustration from that time. I mean, yes, this is a man who should be very cheap with himself, but the heaviness of his body almost feels like a shield to protect him from the world. They even build it into the story because they show him as a young man as being very lean. I love how in the flashback sequence of where he travels back with a very ethereal, very 80s. I got to be honest with you, almost like a little bit too 80s Christmas past. That they give him a father. Nigel Davenport plays Silas Cratchit, and you get to see a real parallelism with the coldness of his father, and then as his father lets him come home, but for 3 days, and then puts him to work at Mr. Fezziwig, which just makes perfect sense. And he comments about how skinny he is, and I just love that because eventually it gets very heavy. It's a very natural. In fairness, films of the 1970s started this approach of using. Actually, maybe you could go back to Tom Jones in the 60s, but by 1984, when you show Victorian England, you're not using expressionism anymore. You're using a naturalistic approach. So now, like even Scrooge's house looks like it's seen better days, threadbare. Uh, the Cratchit house has got peeling paint. When you see them preparing the gooses and the fish, they're using real fish heads that they're cutting off. It's much more of the earth. Everything feels, yes, the costumes are great. Yes, the budget is bigger. Yes, the level of acting is just more contemporary, but it really has the look. You feel like you're in the picture, far less decorous, far less like a costume drama. Uh,
It's a beautiful looking movie, though. I mean,
it,
I think
yes,
the look of this one rivals that of the 1970s Scrooge musical movie. They both look great. They both have a similar look, I would say.
yeah, not trapped at all by a sound stage. And I do like that one line, Scrooge says, Bob Cratchit does well on 15 bob a week. That's how they I mean, the Cratchit house looks a little bit dilapidated. I like how even Scrooge looks like, Bob's not the wealthiest guy, but he's working class. He's not poor. It's a keen thing. David Warner plays Bob Cratchit. Now, for those of you who don't know the name, David Warner was the villain in Time After Time. He plays Jack the Ripper. In Tron, he's the villain. If you saw Titanic, he's the villain who employs Billy Zane. He has made a career playing the worst people on earth. And in here, he's the lovable Bob Cratchit, which I think is so cast against type. And yet it works, just like Roger Rees, who had just done Nicholas Nickleby on Broadway. Maybe you know him from Cheers. Maybe you know him from The West Wing. Is my favorite Fred. He's my favorite because he's not only polite and warm, but he's charismatic and charming. And in so many ways, he really is everything that Ebenezer is not. And you really see that contrast so well. They even do a little thing with the makeup because the lovely Joanna Whaley plays Fanny. Do you remember her at all? She was such a gorgeous girl. She must be in her mid-50s by now. Oh, if she's alive at all. Do people live to be that old?
Right. So this 1984 Christmas Carol is a lot of people's favorite. It's very much beloved.
It is the ensemble really works. Now, I will say this because I know we're going to get to an argument. It's fine. Scott, he's always angry in this, and he argues with the ghost, and he's like, "Yeah, you're repeating my lines to me. I'm going to say something in my defense." There's a much more arrogance, and he doesn't really break out of his very hard shell until very late in the story. You don't see you do see the scene with the children. You see the scene with his breakup with Belle. I like a lot because in that breakup with Belle, he almost goes after her. He even says he almost goes after her, but he's too scared. And you can feel the pain. And then there's that scene at the end of the story. He's like Sim. He does cartwheels and all that other crazy bullshit. I've never liked it. But when he comes to Fred's home and he acknowledges his hard heart and how you know that on some level he blames him. He was mad at Fred for the death of his sister, and you see how happy he is with Fred's wife, and he knows that he once had a chance for love as well. It's a very heartbreaking scene. It's the first and only time in any adaptation, much less the book itself, that I actually truly am almost brought to tears because I feel so sorry for the hand that he's been dealt, and I really admire the generosity, well earned, that he gets at the end. It's definitely more understated. What are your thoughts? I've talked way too much about this.
No, that's great. I don't think I have to say anything. I mean, the 1984 version is, I don't know. It's really stood the test of time. People love it. It's
So
high rated on IMDb.
So besides the various versions that we have seen on TV shows of A Christmas Carol, from the Flintstones to Happy Days to whatever shows on the air now, you've actually seen some of the more zanier films
Well,
like the Muppets.
let me just talk about. I did some research on IMDb. I tried to find. I tried to make a list of the top adaptations that had over 100 votes. So Mickey's Christmas Carol is number one. And this came out in 1983. It's about 20 minutes long, and it's actually very, very good. I mean, people love it. It's very close to the book. It's got some Mickey characters. I think Scrooge McDuck is a pre-existing character. I'm not sure.
Yes, he is. He wasn't created back a long time ago in the Disney realm. Actually, it's kind of funny that Walt Disney would come up with a parody of Scrooge. But I do really want to know, since you did see the Muppets, you saw the Muppets Christmas.
Let me tell you something interesting about the Muppets Christmas Carol. So the Muppets Christmas
Michael Caine.
Michael Caine is Scrooge. He does a great job. I mean, it's Michael Caine. I mean, but the interesting thing about the Muppets Christmas Carol is Gonzo narrates it, and and you know what? This is a lot of people's favorite from their youth. I would say the great thing about this one is Gonzo narrates it not for adults but for children. So you can watch this movie, and it's very close to the book again. So you can watch the Muppet Christmas Carol as a kid, and the stuff that you don't understand, Gonzo will fill you in. He like, if you're a kid, he'll hold your hand and guide you through the stuff that's more difficult to understand. And Michael Caine's performance is one of the best Scrooges. I mean, it's funny how the Scrooge character, we already talked about it in the last episode, but Scrooge character is truly a wonderful character, and I can see why great actors all want to try their hand at Scrooge. I mean, from Patrick Stewart to George C. Scott to Michael Caine to who else? Jim Carrey even. Jim Carrey tries his hand at Scrooge, and Robert Zemeckis.
Let's talk about that one then. Let's actually talk about. I haven't seen it, but I remember it came out only a few years ago. What was your thoughts on?
So the 2009 Robert Zemeckis Christmas Carol. It's another one of Zemeckis's motion capture animated movies. I hate almost all of these movies. I don't know why Zemeckis.
I saw Beowulf.
You know what? That's probably the best one.
And that was pretty good.
I think Beowulf, out of all of Zemeckis' motion capture movies, I think that's the best one. And I think I don't know what it is about that one, but the performances are really good in that one. But the Christmas Carol, I mean, it's just average. I think it's not the worst one. I think Polar Express may be the worst one.
But would you say that, because we just talked about the animated Christmas Carol that was done by Chuck Jones and Robert Davies, how does that compare with the motion capture one by Robert Zemeckis?
Are you talking about the 1971?
Yeah, the one we just mentioned.
Okay, well, the 1971, I think, used motion capture too, but it's not by computers. It's a rotoscoping,
hand drawn rotoscope.
Right. Well, Snow White used rotoscoping. I think that the effect that they're getting with the computer generated, it's very similar to rotoscoping. I mean, there's more.
Did it take you out of the story?
I thought the Polar Express was the worst example of this, but the Christmas Carol is fine. It was fine. I don't think it's totally crazy. One thing they did that when you watch A Christmas Carol is they have the same actor play a lot of different characters that are interacting with each other. So I think that's a huge mistake. I don't know why they do that. I mean,
so Jim Carrey doesn't just play Scrooge?
Jim Carrey I think he plays Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Past. So there's a lot of scenes between the Ghost of Christmas Past and Scrooge, and they're both Jim Carrey. And I don't know. It's just, it just feels so weird. The whole thing.
When Patrick Stewart does it, it's okay.
Well, when Patrick Stewart is doing it, he's doing it in real time. He's switching back and forth. I don't think Jim Carrey's doing
some of that. That's the excitement of it. I see. Well, I know you saw a much more low-tech version. Also, you saw the Mr. Magoo. And Mr. Magoo, in a way, is an Ebenezer Scrooge. He's a benevolent. He's not cheap, but he's very wealthy. and he's incredibly short-sighted. And I know the animation for that could not have been that great, but Jim Backus, very funny. Most people know him as Professor Howell from Gilligan's Island, but he was also the blind-sided, cheery Mr. Magoo. Tell me about that one. How
Well,
was
you
that?
know, that one has some similarities to Bill Murray's Scrooged, where they're
We'll
putting on
get
a
to that in just a moment.
play in, and the play is Christmas Carol. So,
Yeah.
but most of Magoo's Christmas Carol is inside of the play. It's Magoo playing Scrooge. And you know, has a very high IMDb score. It's maybe the fourth. I'll put this list up. It's maybe the fourth best adaptation according to IMDb users, and it's very good. It hews closely to the book, and Magoo is a great Scrooge. You know, Jim Backus was a great actor, right? Um,
Yeah.
it's fun, and it's very
Well,
entertaining.
if Alistair Sim plays Scrooge as an everyman, and if George C. Scott plays Scrooge as a man of business, then where would you place Jim Backus,
Mr. Magoo.
Jim Carrey? I want to know about all three: Jim Backus, Jim Carrey, and Michael Caine. Where did they all fall on that take?
Well, I think that Michael Caine is an everyman. He's definitely trying to channel. He's definitely influenced by the Alistair Sim Scrooge, I think. Now, Mr.
Yeah.
Magoo is. I mean, it's so bizarre watching it because Backus completely threads the needle between being Mr. Magoo and being Scrooge the whole time,
Yeah.
and he does it perfectly. I mean, the guy's amazing, and it makes
So
Magoo's.
it's neither an everyman or a man of business. He's something far more surrealistic.
Well, let me tell you, the Magoo Christmas Carol, Magoo, you're watching Magoo act as Scrooge in a play. So there's multiple levels of meaning going on in a Christmas Carol, right? Bacchus is acting as Magoo, who's acting as Scrooge, and it's just fun, you know. So I think within the fiction of the play, within a play, Magoo is an everyman,
That's
and
interesting.
he's definitely channeling Sim a little bit, but he's a smart enough actor. He brings his own thing to it. He brings his own twist.
And Carrie? How about Carrie's take?
I think Jim Carrey's take is completely hampered, like I said, by this whole motion capture thing. I mean, I really don't like the motion capture, and also Carrey is playing off against himself. You know, what is that famous line? Half of acting is reacting. So when you're acting, when you're reacting to yourself, it makes your whole performance weird.
And
And
I guess you're right. It is the back and forth in a one-man show that makes us more. It makes that digestible. We can watch that in listening to Patrick Stewart. We can watch it because he's everything and everyone.
Patrick Stewart's actually having a back and forth, whereas Jim Carrey, I don't think he is back and forthing. He's doing his lines as one character, then doing his lines as another character.
I have to say, one of my favorite non-linear, non-hardcore adaptations of A Christmas Carol is the 1988 Bill Murray film, Scrooged. It is insane. He's a TV executive. It has all sorts of. It takes place in New York City. It's crazy. What do you think of that film?
You know, the interesting thing about this, it's another play within a play, similar to Mr. Magoo. He is a TV executive. He's producing an adaptation of A Christmas Carol, but you don't get to see very much from that adaptation. That's like that's not there very much for the story. The real story is the one they make up around the Bill Murray character, and he's visited by spirits. I mean, it's not very close to the original story, and they end it with Bill Murray, his character, giving a speech about the true meaning of Christmas at the end. And I don't know if it works that well.
I think, in fairness, there's things about it that do work well and things that don't. I think that he is definitely playing. It's first off, It is a critique of the 80s, in the 80s. And it comes after the market crash, and it comes when people are finally starting to take stock of the yuppie. And I think as a work of satire, it works very well. But what do they say about satire? Satire is something that closes on a Saturday. It did not do well at the box office. It did not do well. In fact, until things like Elf came out, until the Vacation Christmas movie came out, until Home Alone came out, it was popular as a cable movie, but in reality, it's been long forgotten. I would like to see it again because I feel like even if it doesn't fully, I'd like to see, even if it doesn't fully track, what about it is unique. Would you say that he's playing Scrooge as an everyman or as a businessman?
Okay, this is the most interesting thing about Scrooge, okay? You know, we've already talked about in the previous episode about how Scrooge has lost his touch. He's lost his connection to humanity. He's become isolated, and that's part of his problem. Now, in Scrooge, Bill Murray's character is a TV-aholic, even from a young child. He grows up in a fairly lonely childhood, just like Scrooge, and he's watching TV all the time, and that's why he becomes a TV executive. And there are many scenes in this movie where Bill Murray plays Scrooge as a very awkward, socially awkward person, and that's one of the reasons he becomes so isolated, because he has trouble relating to people, because of his childhood isolation, right? I mean, that's a key aspect.
A modernist psychological level to it, which almost makes me go ahead.
Well, yeah, they really key into that. It's very modern, and that it's modern media that's isolating him from his fellow man. That's an interesting theme that they really. I feel like this movie, there's a lot of great ideas, but when they get to the end, they haven't figured out how to end it, and they just give Bill Murray a giant speech at the end.
Which is a cop-out. How about you saw the 2019 miniseries? Tell me about that quickly.
Okay, so 2019, FX, I think it was, tried to do a very adult Christmas Carol.
Guy Pearce played
Scrooge. And Guy Pearce plays Scrooge not as an everyman, but as a super genius that knows everything. He also disparages Christianity and belief in God. They also give Scrooge, later on you'll find out, they give Scrooge some sexual molestation in his childhood.
Oh, my Lord. How inappropriate.
It's very modern in that respect. It sounds
like just a giant mess. Is it just a giant mess?
Well, you know, I've already said that whenever they start adding stuff to these adaptations, it's usually a mistake. And yeah, it doesn't feel right because...
Go ahead.
Because when you make Scrooge, the Scrooge character, into just merely just a guy who was abused, and that's why he's Scrooge, you don't feel a connection to Scrooge anymore. I mean, unless that was your life experience as well.
My last question to you then is: besides, say, a Trump sketch on Saturday Night Live, or another Aaron Sorkin film about, you know, how Steve Jobs is not that the business of the internet, like Jobs or the Facebook guy Zuckerberg, it's not the industry that's bad, it's the guy that's bad. Just be a more ethical person. Beyond that kind of level of superficiality, do you think the story of A Christmas Carol is still relevant today?
Well, yes, of course. I mean,
are we not as midlife crisis men, but as our society today, are we any closer or further away from the world in which Dickens is writing about?
Well, I already discussed this in the last episode a little bit, but yeah, I feel that Dickens, he has his pulse on how the Industrial Revolution has changed the modern world and created a situation where we feel like all you really need to do in life, all you really should be doing in life, is pursuing money. I mean, why Why have friendships? Why get married? Why have children? You know, and if you look at the modern world, most of us tend to be more Scrooge-like as time goes on. I mean, we're not having families, we're not having kids.
Consumerism of Christmas, which is kind of an offset of the Victoriana era of Christmas, and the fact that we are now all worried about paying bills, which makes us take less vacation, less holiday time, less time with our family so we can support a lifestyle that doesn't really feed us in a spiritual or meaningful way. Do you think these are the elements of the story that are as true in 2020 as they were in 1843?
Well, yes. I mean, the world of Dickens is not that different from ours. And I think that's why when you see these adaptations, you notice that like there's a lot of works when they're adapted, they try to make them contemporary, they try to contemporize them. Well, A Christmas Carol, they hardly ever try to do that because you don't need to do that. I feel.
Well, it has been done and it does been done. And I will say at day's end, it's a fungible concept because it's inherently, I would argue, a humanist tale about how it's so easy to become overcome with fear. It's so very easy to disconnect. It's so very easy to lose a sense of who we are and wind up in a place where we don't mean to be. And then if we get a moment of empathy, a moment of realization that we're part of something greater than ourselves, then in that moment we find an opportunity to move forward with our lives and be more than just something on ourselves. And I think as long as human beings are human beings dealing with the problems of being a human being, I think much like the works of Shakespeare or Greek mythology, this story will travel long beyond us. And with that said, I'd like to wish all of our listeners, if you celebrate Christmas, Merry Christmas. If you observe Christmas, Merry Christmas. Happy Hanukkah, which already passed, but it's Hanukkah while I recorded this. Kwanzaa, Eastern Orthodox, whatever religion or no religion. Be well, be safe. A new year will be upon us, and I hope it will be a better one than the one that is past. I hope you are well and good. Randall, do you have any wishes to offer our wonderful viewers this year?
Yeah, ditto everything you said. And yeah, Merry Christmas, everyone.
Happy holidays and a happy new year.